Welcome to the Uncharted podcast. I am your host, Inez Franklin. My hope for you today is that we discover faith beyond the boundaries. Uncharted is intended to be a safe place for you to listen, learn, and challenge yourself along your journey of faith. May grace and peace be with you today. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to Uncharted with Inez Franklin, where we are rediscovering faith beyond the boundaries. Today, I'm going to introduce you to my good friend, Ike Miller. He just came out with a book called Good Baggage. You never see those two words together, Good Baggage. And it says how your difficult childhood prepared you for healthy relationships. Now, you probably remember that I interviewed Sharon Hodde Miller about her book, The Cost of Control. It's on our feed. If you haven't listened, you can go back and listen. This is her husband, Ike Miller. Together, they founded a church in Durham, North Carolina called Bright City Church. And Ike writes this book out of his own personal experience of trauma and some childhood experiences that really affected his relationship as an adult, including his own role as a pastor of his church. And listen, we all have those stories that from our past that color the way we view our relationships or even interact in our relationships as adults. Things that maybe habits or maybe coping mechanisms that actually now harm us in our relationships. So you're going to find this conversation to be extremely helpful and the book extremely useful. And it has so many tips, not just information, but actually action items that we can take to improve our relationships by finding healing in our past traumas and bringing them from being a bad baggage, something that hurts, to being a good baggage, something that actually becomes helpful in our relationships. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I did together with Kayleigh, and yes, so good. Enjoy, share it with your friends, and do get the book. Well, Ike, welcome. We are so glad that you're with us today. Thank you. Thank you for being on the Uncharted podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've been looking forward to an opportunity to chat about the book with you.
Awesome. Well, on the Uncharted podcast, we talk about rediscovering faith beyond the boundaries. And what we mean by that is that the journey of faith isn't as linear as we sometimes think. We think everybody's story is the same, and maybe I don't have a story because somebody else's story seems so amazing. And so we try to really break that down here. And it's a few times that we have a chance to talk to a pastor, and not only that, but talk to a pastor who is as willing to be vulnerable as you are. Like in your book, you shared very vulnerably about your journey, your family, your personal struggles, which obviously sometimes people are afraid to do, period.
Yeah.
But even
absolutely.
more so when they're in some position of leadership. And so first I want to thank you. Thank you for being the way that you are and for offering your heart so willingly.
You're welcome. Well, and thank you for, I think in this journey, there's been moments where you're kind of, okay, if I share this, what are people going to think? And in particular, as a pastor, I think we're changing. I think our culture is changing around this some, but I think there's still this sense of like the pastor's supposed to have it all together. And, one of the things that Sharon and I share quite frequently is that we go to marriage counseling. We have every month for 13 years. And I was telling our church a couple of weeks ago, I said, I tell people that the reason we do that is kind of like maintenance on your car. You take it in every 5,000 miles to make sure everything's running smoothly, change the oil. You don't wait till it's dead on the side of the road and take it to a shop. You take care of it. You will take care of it while they're little problems before they turn into big problems, and we share that all the time. But inevitably, I still have somebody that comes up after a service that says, you said you guys are in counseling. Are you okay? So there is a little bit of that for sure. But honestly, I have found that when I have shared vulnerably and shared kind of my journey, what I've been through, more than condemnation or skepticism, I've gotten people resonating with that and finding out, oh, my story is so similar. This is what I've been through. And it actually opens up space for us to talk about real life instead of just staying on the surface of things.
Very true. I love the analogy of the car versus our relationship, because
Yeah,
we all know our cars will break down if we don't service them.
that's right.
There's an inherent assumption that cars break down.
Mm-hmm.
And we also know that we, in our relationships, will break down if we don't
Yeah,
take care of ourselves. But we don't
yeah,
want to believe that truth.
that's
we,
right.
we want to pretend, no, it won't. And so when we see someone being vulnerable, like you have been, and I believe I've been in my journey, Kayleigh has been as well,
Mhm.
people are startled by that because it challenges that assumption of, well, my relationship should be fine. I'm in love. It
Mm-hmm.
should never break
Mm-hmm.
down.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that assumption is what we're really breaking down, because it's not only wrong and not true, but it harms us when we believe that,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and we in our relationships have wear and tear on our relationships, just like our cars. And we have rough seasons, and we need to take the time to work through those rough seasons instead of just bucking up and keep going, because at some point that is going to surface and it's going to create challenges. And so being proactive about it, I feel like has helped us so much, versus it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to buy this car and it's just going to, I hope it just lasts me as long as it possibly can. I think when we enter, especially romantic relationships, we kind of think, okay, we're coming in with a certain amount of horsepower and a certain amount of
Yeah.
chemistry. Let's see how far it can get us. And discovering the secret that no, actually, you can increase your horsepower in your relationship. There's things that you can do to help continue and increase the longevity of your relationship. And so it's not just what are you starting with and how far can it get you, but you can actually continue to grow that relationship.
Yeah, and I think that, as you guys were chatting about it, for me, I've experienced a lot of people who just feel like needing help or accepting help from therapy, from mentorship, from your pastors in the space of your relationship feels like almost like defeating in a
Mm,
way. And so
mm-hmm.
people feel like I have to be able to do this by myself or by ourselves. We
Yeah.
need to be able to figure this out between the two of us, which is really just kind of a detriment, even in our relationships, but also in our journey of faith, to think that we have to figure out all these things by ourselves. So I love that you have this transparency of, nope, we all need help. We all get help. We do it with community, with mentorship, with relationships, with therapy. And this is
Mm-hmm.
how we learn and grow along our journey of faith.
Yeah, one of the things I tell our church all the time is that I want our church to be much more like an AA meeting and less like a country club.
Love that. I love that.
Kind of the idea of like, we're all coming in with stuff. Like, let's not pretend like we don't. When you go to an AA meeting, it's like, we know why we're all here, and the
Yeah.
same thing being true for the church. Like, we all know why we're here because we need healing, not because we've got it all figured out. And I think when we have this kind of country club mentality to church, or this sense of like, I've just got to come with this appearance like I've got it all together, that makes it even more difficult then to be honest when you really need help, because now you're letting down the facade. Whereas,
Yeah.
hey, I'm here to seek out healing, to have community around me to help me pursue healing. Then saying, hey, I need help is just a part of what we do. And so I think some of it's just in the culture of our communities as well.
And you model it. You model it so beautifully. So it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Can we
Well,
go back a little bit, Ike? Can we?
yeah.
Can we? I would love to hear about your own journey of faith. Like
Mhm.
when
Mhm.
did you start a relationship with Jesus, and how has that journey gone? Because I think to get to this place where you can be this vulnerable and
Mhm.
have this cultural vulnerability, I believe that comes from a very deep place of relationship with God and a confidence in who you are.
Mhm.
So that came along on your journey of faith somewhere. So
Yes.
yeah, tell us your journey of faith.
Yeah. So I grew up in a family that went to a church near our house, and a really great church. But I think it was really kind of when I started middle school that I really started to get involved with kind of our student ministry there, and had an incredible youth pastor who was really intentional about helping people discern a call to ministry. And so I built a great relationship with him as I discerned that call to ministry. But I also found that my youth pastor, along with my mom, were huge sources of uh, encouragement and comfort in the challenges of what were happening in our home and our family. And so I think I just dove in really hard into my faith community in sort of those formative years. And a big part of that was, I think, when we have these kinds of experiences, especially in our childhood, and we're like, why is this happening? Why is God allowing this to happen? Why doesn't God just heal my parents' marriage? Those were all questions that I couldn't answer, and I couldn't get an answer to. It's not as if God was just going to give me an answer. But what did begin to form in me, and I think that this is what began much of what led to kind of sharing more openly about this, was I realized, okay, I may not know why these things are happening, but I do know I'm not the only person that's gone through them. And so if there's things that I can learn about how to go through these well and then share that with others, then I can redeem some of what I've experienced in a way that says, yeah, God did not want what happened to me. Some things happen simply because of the sin and brokenness of our world, but that doesn't mean they're beyond redemption. And so a big part of that was me developing sort of that sense of, I think how we help people most is sharing our failures, sharing our struggles. I think, I've heard it said, if we want to impress people, we share our successes. If we want to impact people, share our failures and our struggles. And I feel like that has just been kind of a motto and a mantra for me to live by in those moments, especially where you feel this need to like create an appearance of like how you've got it all together, and realize that might be impressive, but it's not really going to impact people and it's not really going to help people. And so that's what I really want to do. That's what I want to see happen.
I love that. At this point, I believe our listeners are going, okay, what's he talking about?
Yeah.
What story? So if they have not read the book, which by the way, friends, his book is called Good Baggage. And so you definitely want to go to Amazon and get it right away. However, tell us, what was the problem? What was the challenge you were dealing with as a kid that your mom and your youth pastor helped you through?
So my father struggled with an alcohol use disorder or alcoholism, and that caused obviously relational problems between him and my mom. My dad at times could be very controlling of my mom, and in times abusive towards me. And so what that meant was there was a lot of kind of chaos in our house, a lot of fighting. He was never verbal toward or abusive towards my mom, but there was just a lot of arguing and fighting. Eventually, they separated when I was sort of towards the end of elementary school. My father developed prostate cancer when I was in middle school, and my mom kind of saw this as a second chance for him. And so he moved back in, and it seemed like things were moving in a good direction. And then he went back to drinking and eventually was driving with us under the influence. And that kind of led to my mom feeling like, okay, out of protection for the kids, I have to, move forward with separation and divorce. And so they were separated most of high school and then divorced when I was a senior in high school.
Yeah. Wow.
Do you still have a relationship with your dad now?
So actually, my father passed away in 2007 as a result of kind of complications from the alcoholism. And so, towards the end of high school, I actually felt like I needed to try to build a relationship with my dad on our own terms, not just sort of in conjunction with my mom and my family. And so I did reach out, kind of wrote a letter to him with kind of all of the things that I was feeling and thinking. And his response to that, granted, I understand, was sort of, there's two sides to every story kind of thing. And I understand that. But at the same time, I think he did start to be more intentional about our relationship. He would come and visit while I was at college, and we connected more. And so the relationship, I think we were starting to kind of move that in a healthier direction. But then he passed in 2007. And so, yeah.
Well, I relate to your story so much. My father was also an alcoholic, but he left when I was a year old, so I didn't grow up with him. My siblings, the older siblings, grew up with him, so they had a little bit more relationship with him. And the pain is very different for those who have a relationship and who don't. But it still leaves deep scars. So you're talking about your book about good baggage. I've always thought of baggage for myself. Because I have a testimony of making some really poor choices in my life, my personal choices. I always look at baggage as all the bad choices that I've made.
Mhm.
And I always describe them as a U-Haul truck size of baggage that Jesus had to come and rescue me
Mm.
from. But this baggage you talk about in your book isn't that. This is about the wounds and the traumas that you
Mhm.
experienced as you were growing up in this, and now you dare to call them good, to
Yes.
call
Yeah.
them good,
Yes.
and that's just so bold
Yeah.
because, well, first of all, the whole baggage thing, people are thinking in one
Yeah.
direction, but then to then call it good is another. So
Yeah.
how did you get that? How did you go from having the experience as a child to then calling this a good baggage?
Good baggage. Well, so the couple things on that, when I started to process this, really what brought a lot of this to the surface, I was aware of how my childhood had impacted me to some degree, but it was really during COVID that leading through COVID forced a lot of this to the surface for me. So, for example, during COVID, as a pastor, you're making choices for your whole congregation around are you going to meet in person? Are you going to meet indoor? Are you going to wear masks? You're making choices that at the end of the day, no matter what choice you make, somebody's going to be upset with you.
Yeah.
And I, after months of that, just found myself emotionally exhausted. I was just wrung out and I took about a month off. And during that time was really processing, why is it so hard for me when somebody disagrees with me? Why is it so hard for me to deal with the criticism? And I was digging into some of the impact of my childhood, and I was reading more about codependency. And as I was reading about this, so codependency is what I call a trauma-related loss of self, meaning at some point in your life you went through something where you had to be someone other than yourself in order to survive, whether mentally, emotionally, physically. But in that process, you lose a clear sense for who you are. And so much of who you are is wrapped up in how do I appease this person in my life, whether it's a alcoholic parent, an abusive spouse, whatever it may be. You become whoever you need to be for them to be happy with you. And so, and I was reading about this. One of the things they said is that in codependency, you use your words and actions to manage someone else's emotions and reactions.
Mhm.
And as I read that, I realized that's exactly what I've been doing with my church. Is I've become codependent with my whole church, trying to manage their
So good.
emotions and reactions with my words and actions. And so that kind of sent me on this journey of exploring what are the other ways that my childhood has impacted me as a pastor and a leader. And so that kind of got me on this. But then when things started to change, I realized that some of those things actually could be used for good in my leadership. And so when I talk about baggage, what we're talking about are the coping mechanisms that we develop in a dysfunctional relationship that we then carry into another relationship with different dynamics. And so we call it baggage because they are these mechanisms that we use to keep us safe in one relationship, but no longer need in this relationship. And so that's why in other relationships it goes so sideways, is because we're carrying those things into it when they don't belong there. They're not necessary there. So one of my sort of pieces of good baggage or coping mechanisms from my childhood is a need to sort of keep everyone around me happy. So with my father, for example, so much of my well-being and my security was tied up in how is my father feeling? Is he angry? Is he happy? Is he sad? And so when you would walk into a room, you automatically sort of start assessing the emotional climate of the room. Is it safe to be here? Is he
Instinctively,
angry?
right? Without even
Yes.
thinking about
You
it.
don't
Yeah.
even think about it. Yes. And so as an adult now, every room I walk into, I'm assessing the emotional climate of the room. How are people feeling? How are people responding? People seem happy with me. Are they upset with me? And the way that works negatively is we take responsibility for all of that. Well, if somebody in this room's upset, I must have done something wrong. I need to fix it. The good baggage of that, though, is if we can learn to take those coping mechanisms and figure out, okay, this is what's in me. How do I use it for good now? So a way that I use that for good now is when I go into a staff meeting with my team, for example, I can kind of assess the room and see, how is my team doing today? How are people feeling? Do we need to take a break before we jump into business and say, hey, it looks like something's on your mind. Do we need to talk about that? Is there something going on a deeper level? With my wife, when I come in to the house, and I can tell something's off, I can detect that and I can start a conversation versus her having to to bring it up, and figure
So it's
out
like an
when is she going to bring
empathy,
that up.
right? I
Yes,
think in your book
exactly.
you referred to it as empathy. Yes,
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah, exactly. So much of this is the good baggage is taking coping mechanisms that we've sort of outgrown. They're no longer useful to us as we use them in our childhood, and figuring out how do we use them in relationships now for good.
Yeah, gosh, when you talk about codependency, it's so real because
Yeah.
I was previously married in a very toxic marriage. So we have exited that. And I really had to come to terms with, in every situation, like I made the choice. I said yes, I said I do. I stay married. So like it's not just that I was with someone who was not healthy. It was also that I made decisions out of my own bad mechanisms, bad coping choices to get myself there. And I was definitely the codependent. Like I was, anytime he was off, I was off, and it really impacted not just me, but our kids. We have two girls, and you could really see how now my 6-year-old is very similar. Like she very much is like, if someone's upset, she's upset. And I've had to really work with her to say, it's okay. It's okay if this is going on, and this is how we release it and work through it. In that same way, though, it is so true that I've now, as I've healed, been able to come to the point where I can acknowledge, hey, there's this experience, this feeling, emotion, whatever's happening, and it may not be my responsibility, but I can walk with the person through it, right? So it's kind of like you're talking about, it's taking this negative coping mechanism, this bad baggage, and making it so that at least it helps you in a different way that is very beneficial, right? Now I can take this and acknowledge, but I'm not taking responsibility. I'm not holding it on my shoulders as something that I've done wrong.
Yeah. The sort of the antidote to codependency is self-differentiation, sort of the ability to remain relationally close to people without being hijacked emotionally by them, And so where do I end and someone else begin, so that I can determine what is mine to solve, what is mine to take care of, and what is yours to take care of. You mentioned kind of codependency and kind of your part in sort of, I made this decision and I made that decision. What's so interesting is codependency is almost, it has that dependency in it. It's almost an addiction of its own, in the sense that we find ourselves at times frustrated with ourselves that we're codependent, that we don't know how to do this differently, that we don't know how to say no to this or express ourselves openly. And yet, even when we're so frustrated with ourselves about it, we can't break ourselves of it. And so in that way, it can function very much like an addiction in itself.
Well, don't they have support groups for
That's right.
codependency? Because it can become, there's something we get out of it. I remember, because of course I've dealt with codependency myself, because I came like you, I had to manage, and I learned instinctively, which is truly incredible, how children have the ability to cope and create all these mechanisms to survive a situation. They're so resilient, right? But I did those things as well. But I remember a therapist saying to me, "What are you getting out of this? Like somehow you keep going there because there's something that's actually helping you, or that you need, that you're getting out of it. And at minimum, you need to be aware of why you're drawn to this, why you're drawn towards that." And I feel like you have done that. As I read your book, I can see that you've worked through, like, why was I coping in that way, and what was I getting out of it? In your case, peace in the room, right?
That's right.
If you could manage people's emotions,
Yes.
Dad's not going to yell at me, Mom and Dad aren't going to fight, and so therefore I'm going to have peace. I'm going to feel safe. That's a very powerful motivator to become codependent. Absolutely.
Well, and then as adults, carrying that into other spaces, it gives you a sense of, this is where my value comes from, is my ability to care for people and to love people. And that's where I think we struggle to know the difference between self-sacrificing love and codependency. We don't have a clear sense for, when have I stepped into codependency versus self-sacrificing love. And a lot of that is because we get a sense of meaning from our codependency. This is the role that I play in this person's life. And so we gain a sense of purpose from that, of meaning from that. Even if at the end of the day, we realize it's not healthy, we don't really know who we are apart from the role that we play in their life. And so, yeah, there's certainly some kind of payoff, and we've got to learn what that is and figure out, where else do I get that from?
Oof, that is so powerful. I really love that just reminder of like, you really have to look inward as well and
Mm,
figure out, what part do you play and how do we move forward from that. So I hear you did that within your
mhm,
church, right? You
mhm,
have worked to do that even within your marriage of like, hey,
mhm.
I'm not going to allow this good baggage to kind of create this narrative story in my relationships. Now, thankfully we are outside of these COVID years, but I don't feel like
Yeah.
we're outside of the years of having to deal with churches that now have very different, right? We are like constantly, I feel, up against this. What's this new challenge, this new theology, this new
Mhm.
expectation of the church? How do you feel that you handle that today, leading a church, being married, going through all of these processes?
Yeah. I one of the practices that I've developed is that pre-pandemic and even early in the pandemic, I lived with this sense of, I don't want to have limits. I want to be able to do everything that I want to be able to do time wise, work wise, without ever having to stop or to rest. And a lot of that was driven by my fear that my limits were going to somehow limit my leadership, and that I
Mm.
was in some way going to run up against the limits of my leadership if I couldn't just keep going, keep going. And what I realized is, by doing that, I never had the time to process my internal world. And so when I left one meeting that made me anxious or made me frustrated, and then went straight into the next one, and then had another meeting that was frustrating or created a different kind of anxiety, and then left that and went into another one, by the end of the day, I've just got this big ball of anxiety and frustration and stress and anger. And I can't really tell you where any of it comes from, because I just piled it in on top of the other. And so one of the biggest things for me since then has been saying, okay, when I'm starting to feel anxiety or feel frustration or anger, I need to stop and name where that's coming from. Otherwise, I'm going to
Mm.
put it on the next person I go into a meeting with, or it's just going to get caught up in everything, and I'm going to put it on my wife and kids at the end of the day. And so
Yeah.
a big practice for me has been, when I notice myself feeling anxiety or feeling frustrated or anger, then the practice has been to stop and name where that's coming from. And sometimes that takes time. Sometimes it's not just immediately clear. A
Yeah.
lot of times I have to go 2 or 3 layers down, because it's often something connected to my identity. Meaning, I feel like, okay, if I don't do this well, that's going to reflect negatively on me as a leader. And I find my value in being a leader. So if they don't think I'm a good leader, then they don't think highly of me. And so that fear creeps in. But if I can name that and say, okay, my identity is not at stake in this moment, my value
Mm.
is not at stake in this moment, it allows me to step back and to be able to process and respond and enter from a healthier place. And so much of it is, how do we name what we're feeling in the moment, and then be able to speak truth to that so that we don't carry it into the wrong situation.
That does require kind of a personal awareness
Mm,
of your emotions. A lot of
mhm.
times I feel we can go around not even touching our emotions. We're so thinking elsewhere. We
Yeah.
don't realize when someone says to us, "You seem a little intense." We're like, "No, I'm not."
What are you talking about?
Yeah, what are you talking about? Now I'm intense because you've said it.
That's
It's
right.
like, but we're leaking it everywhere.
Yes.
People can
Yes.
tell we're anxious, or whatever. So it takes a great deal of pause and a practice of learning what our emotions are. And I'd like in your book you shared a set of questions. Uh, uh, Sorry, I got to remember where the chapter was, where you had this sort of like layering of seeing what
Hmm.
really is the problem.
Yeah.
And one of them
Hmm.
had to do with the scarcity of materials. You
Yes.
know the chapter that's in.
Yeah.
But these layering of questions that helps us get from, we think this is the issue, but if we ask the questions, we start to see, oh, there's the issue.
Yeah.
And so having that process has to be super helpful.
that tool has been a life changer for me. So the tool
While
is...
you talk, I'm going to find it in the book.
Yeah, go for it. So the tool actually, this is kind of crazy. The tool actually originated in Toyota manufacturing factories. And it was a tool that they used to diagnose issues in their factory. So the way that it would work is, if they were having a delay in some part of their factory, say, in having windshields installed, they would go to the person who was responsible for that, and they would ask the first why. Why are you delayed in getting your windshield installed? And they'd say, well, the guy who prepares the windshields for me is delayed. So they'd go to him and say, hey, why are you delayed in getting the windshields prepped? And he's like, well, the delivery guy is delayed. So they go to the delivery guy and say, why are you delayed? And he'd say, well, the manufacturer of windshields is delayed. So they go to the manufacturer and say, hey, why is it delayed? And they'd say, there's a scarcity or shortage of materials. And the point of that is, by the time you've gotten to that fourth or fifth why, you've answered your first question, which is the windshields are delayed because there's a shortage of materials. But what we often do is we just treat that initial why, right? So if the windshields are consistently delayed, let's just fire that guy and put somebody else in his place. Well, it doesn't matter who you put in that place. It's not going to fix the real issue, which is the shortage of materials. And so I started applying that to my own life. And just to give you guys a very vulnerable example of this, I was having a lot of anxiety around my preaching and preaching on Sunday mornings. And so I just
know
stopped.
That feeling.
I said, why am I anxious about this? And the first answer was, well, because I want to, quite honestly, I want to impress people. I want to be amazing. I want to do this really well. Why do I want this to do this well? Well, because I want people to enjoy coming to our church, and I want people to come to our church. Well, why do I want people to come to our church? Well, because I want to have a growing church. Well, why do you want to have a growing church? Well, because I think that's what it means to sort of be a good pastor, is you've got a growing church and you're an impressive preacher. And that is the point at which I realized, this isn't about wanting to do a good job on Sunday. This is about wanting to be seen as a good pastor and being seen as an impressive preacher. And so I had to then say, okay, my value does not come from being an impressive preacher. My value comes from being a child of God, over whom God declared, this is my child in whom I'm well pleased, because what's true of Christ is true of us when we believe in him. And so that really helped me diagnose the real issue versus how do I just preach better? How do I get more illustrations? How do I be funnier? All those kinds of things.
Yeah. That
I
is
love
so
that.
good.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. As you're talking, I realized I have a 6-year-old and a almost 4-year-old, and my 6-year-old is in therapy, and her therapist is incredible and has really given me so many tools. And a lot of it comes down to this same idea, right? It's like, don't take the surface emotion. Like, she's going to have a tantrum or a big emotion or like explode or suddenly be so quiet. Don't take that as like her not listening or her disobeying or her intentionally doing anything. Figure out why this is coming up. And it's never, the toy didn't work or her sister didn't play. It's like always something so deep down. And so we often have these really incredible conversations once we get past that. I was just talking actually to my mom the other day and saying, I love so much about this. It's very much me, which is she wants to get it right the first time. And so a lot of times when like reading is hard or like something in school is hard, it's because she feels like she can't get it right immediately, and then she just feels like she's failing. And so we have to kind of work past like, hey, it's okay, slow it down, you're going to get it right. It doesn't matter if it's right the first time. We are walking through this together. We are all learning. It's how we do better. And once we get to that point, then helping her learn to read or helping her learn to do a math problem, it's so much easier because we realize why she's struggling in the first place.
Yeah.
As we finish up today, I'd love to hear from you kind of just an overview of what you would recommend for someone who's brand new in this process, someone who's hearing you today or hearing this podcast and saying, oh my gosh, how do I even start? How do I start digging into those things? How do I ask myself those questions? What would be your recommendation for them?
I think the first step for a lot of folks, especially if they're not comfortable with the step of seeking out a counselor, the best first step is to begin noticing patterns in your emotions. What I mean by that is starting to pay attention to the situations and the moments that create strong emotional reactions for you, whether that is anger or fear or anxiety, because that's trying to tell you something. It's trying to tell you something about an area of struggle, an area of insecurity, an area of fear. And oftentimes there's something underneath those that even if the situations don't immediately present as the same, there's something that's a part of them that's the same. And so I encourage people to start paying attention to the patterns in your emotional world and then begin to explore why. Why do I respond this way? Why do I respond with anger? Why do I respond with fear? Why do I respond with withdrawing? And so I think beginning there, and then I would encourage you to seek out a counselor or even just a good friend who listens well, that can help you be as a sounding board. It could be a pastor, someone that you trust to kind of share those things vulnerably with, and then begin reading about some of this stuff. There's so many good resources out there. Another great book that I encourage people to read a lot is called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. It's just a phenomenal read on this kind of stuff. But just beginning to do some research and reading and learning more about it. And then I think you'll build up kind of that courage to take more steps from there.
I love that. Well, of course, I recommend people pick up your book, Good Baggage, because that was chapter 1. Is anything ever going to be really okay? This desire to make things right because the world is so broken, and how we, especially if we are in a traumatic situation, in a family or a situation that's causing us a great deal of pain, we're trying to fix it because we need it to survive. So that was chapter 1 of Ike's book, Good Baggage, how your difficult childhood prepared you for healthy relationships. So good. And you quote some other really good books in there, including John Townsend and Henry Cloud's book on boundaries, which you talk about the importance of boundaries. There's a lot more fabulous things in here that we can't cover in a short podcast, but I hope that our listeners were encouraged to learn more about you and learn more about your book. And Ike, can you, as we close, we're going to put on the show notes how people can find you, of course. But if there's anything you want to leave as a closing remark for our listeners, maybe those who are hearing themselves as you share, and maybe those who man, I haven't even started this, a word of encouragement for them, that would be awesome.
I want to leave you with the story of the lame man by the pool at Bethesda. Jesus sees this man who has been laying by the pool. He's been crippled for 30, 40 years. And Jesus goes up to him and says, "Do you want to be well?" And his response is, "Every time I try to go get in the water, somebody beats me to it, or there's no one to help me in the water." And I think we find ourselves in that place where we want to experience healing. We want that. But for some reason, something always gets in the way. There's some obstacle. And what Jesus says to this man is, "Get up, take your mat, and walk." He doesn't say, "Be well." He doesn't say, "Believe in me and you'll be made well." He invites him to start taking steps. And I want to invite the audience to just begin taking steps, to figure out what is the first step that I can take. Because the reality is every step you take is going to be a step towards healing. And it may be a long journey. It may not happen immediately. But to know each step you take is going to be good for you, but it's also going to be for the relationships that matter most to you in your life. So just start taking steps.
That's perfect. That. Yeah. Thank you so much, Ike. Thank you for today and for your time. We will definitely leave all of your information down in our show notes for anyone who wants to learn more about you, your church, or your book. Also, the book you recommended just a little bit ago, I'm going to put that down in the show notes as well. If anybody wants to be a part of this conversation, please send us an email at hello@InesFranklin.com, right? Yep. Okay.
You got it. Yes.
I'm getting better at that one. And so hello@InesFranklin.com for anyone who missed me in my confusion. And thank you so much for just listening in. And we hope that you will be able to learn with us along this journey.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Uncharted Podcast with Inés Franklin. Learn more about Inés at unchartedpod.com. Follow Inés' journey on Instagram at Inés Franklin. Sign up for our email list to receive direct access to online experiences and more. Thanks for listening, and join us again next time.